I'm going to, by way of motivation today, read out a little quote, well, not a little, but a very beautiful quote from Lama Tsongkhapa. And in this quote, he's talking about how unbelievably precious, in fact, how the most precious of all the practitioners is the young or even baby bodhisattva, the one who's aspiring to become enlightened for the benefit of others, hasn't managed yet to generate that mind purely, but is really, really, really from the very bottoms of their hearts wishing to do so, and they know why they're wishing to do so. This thought, this inkling that is dawning, says Lama Tsongkhapa, is unbelievably precious because it's the source from which all Buddhas spring, all hearers spring, all solitary realizers spring, all happiness springs from this thought. So the fact that we might generate it this time, in this lifetime, even in this vestigial dawning stage, I'm just speaking sort of poetically here, is unbelievable that it somehow has occurred to us to do it this time. We've had countless rebirths, but this time, this is our plan. This is an unbelievable resolve. So Tsongkhapa says, just as when one sees a young sprout with its main stalk and so on of a medicinal tree that could produce desired fruits, one nurtures the plant with special care during its sapling stage. With its tender leaves, one must nourish and care and nurture with great effort a bodhisattva on the beginner's stage, who represents the sprout that could bring forth the tree of the Buddha, as well as a wellspring of relief for all beings. So this is addressed to us, and not at all accidentally. The earliest commentary on the Wheel of Sharp Weapons by Kabdag Dorje Chang Chempo Lo Sang Yeshi Tempa Rabje Pel Sangpo is called the nectar that produces the sprout benefiting others. So here we have a deliberate concordance, an exact concordance between this idea that Lama Tsongkhapa's infusing us with, inspiring us with, and the crucial purpose of this text. They're absolutely the same. So Lama Tsongkhapa, in his famous exposition of Chandrakirti's supplement to the Middle Way, goes on to make a very key distinction between thinking about generating this mind and actually generating it. And he spells this out by giving a very beautiful rustic analogy. He says, for example, just as there is an experience of tasting the bark of sugarcane and the experience of tasting what is inside the bark, in the same manner, the mere thought, I will attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings, is only a reflection that follows after the words. This is similar to the tasting of the bark of sugarcane. Although it is called generating the awakening mind, it is still not the actual generated mind. In contrast, the extraordinary experience that had arisen on the basis of training in accordance with the instructions of cultivating awakening mind, an experience that can wonderfully bring about an effect in one's mind, is analogous to tasting the actual sugarcane inside the bark. This, therefore, is the genuine generation of the awakening mind. With this in mind, the Invoking the Altruistic Resolve Sutra says, quote, just like the bark, it is but speech, the real mind is the taste. So this is what we're striving for, not just the bark of this incredible mind, but we want to taste it. We want to be able to incorporate it into our very beings. So with that as our motivation, we'll now do the Tonlen meditation, again based on verse 95. And I'll just reiterate Geshe Doga's oral instructions, which are very concise. There are more expanded presentations, but this is a very pith instruction. We must realize that all the suffering and all the pain that we experience in this life has no other source than in the harm we have caused to many other beings, in both this and past lifetimes, with a self-centered motivation, with a self-cherishing mind. So visualize the Guru Lord Buddha upon the crown of one's head and see that the true cause of our suffering and pain is causing suffering to others. So pray to the Guru Buddha on one's crown. May all the sufferings of all other beings fall upon myself. Having clearly recognized the cause of the suffering and having prayed to Guru Buddha, then visualize sending the breath out from the nostrils in the form of rays of light, which go to all the suffering sentient beings. When these rays of light reach suffering sentient beings, they are relieved spontaneously, completely freed from all their suffering. So imagine this thought, this giving, by the power of this thought, this giving, all other beings attain everlasting happiness. So I've given them the gift of happiness, pure happiness. Then, on the inward breath, imagine that you're breathing in the smoke of all beings' sufferings and that you are taking on their suffering and pain. Imagine that it all dissolves into your self-cherishing mind and all their suffering immediately vanishes. And as this absorption into the heart occurs, we visualize our own self-cherishing as a black lump. Some lamas say a pile of sand or a pile of rocks. They're all to aid the power of the meditation. But the point is that as we absorb all the suffering of others, it completely antidotes, it exactly annihilates the self-cherishing attitude at our core, which is pulverized and dispersed, leaving not a single atom. And out of that vast openness, which is love and compassion, we send another radiant wave of giving. And then we can take even more subtle pain because we've got a purer mind. And in this way, the effect of the meditation is cumulative. So while performing this meditation, I'll recite the verses and chant them. De Ache Sun Lama Tu Che Chen Ma Gu Dro We Ti Dri Du Ngao Kun Maludata Dalamin Pa Dadagi Dege Shen La Tang Wai Trokunde Dang Tempa Jingi Lo De Na Jesun Lama Tu Je Chen Magudro Dig drib dugnel kumaludata daglamin padang dagideje shen la tangwa kunde dang dempa jin gilo dena je tsun lama tu je chen magu drowe di drip du ngao kun maludata dalamin pa dandagi deje jen la tang wai drokunde dang dempa jingi lo drokun de dang dempa jingi lo. So thank you. So you'll remember last week we dealt with verse 11, which was a direct Tonlen instruction saying, whenever suffering arises in our mind, now we should willingly take upon ourselves all their dukkha without exception. This next verse, verse 12, which I'm going to ask John to show, we're going to use the Burzen translation, which is, that's good to keep up, but that's the Venerable Joan Nacelle translation. So the one I sent just before the teaching, John, it's called Wheel of Well-Spoken, Wheel of Sharp Weapons by Geshe Noen Dagi. Page 9. And it's verse 12, yeah. Great, thank you so much. The reason I'm jumping from translations is because they all offer something slightly different. And I find that the Alex Burzen translation, which was done in conjunction with Geshe Noen Dagi, has a particular sort of punchiness about it, which I find is very evocative, very, very penetrating. When hunger or violent thirst overwhelms us, this is the wheel of sharp weapons returning full circle upon us for the wrongs we have done. Till now, we have kept what we had without sharing. We have plundered and stolen and lured people on. Hereafter, let's take from them hunger and thirst. So you can see here that we've got an exact Tonlen instruction again. We're now taking on their hunger and thirst. The commentary for this verse says that whenever the anguish of hunger or thirst arises in ourselves, we think this is the result of the bad actions committed in previous rebirths, of having cheated others for the sake of their wealth, stolen others' property and appropriated it by force, and having been miserly with our own wealth. So think now, however much suffering of hunger and thirst of other sentient beings exists, I will willingly take it all upon my own suffering of hunger and thirst. And as before, make the request and meditate on giving and taking. End of quote. You can see here that each verse is actually an instruction to perform Tonlen with a particular emphasis in each case. So it's interesting here, isn't it, to consider how luring people on is itself a form that's going to bounce back as overwhelming hunger and thirst. It's a way of dragging them away from their objects that are giving them happiness and pleasure for our own gain. And so this is in fact simply talking about, and I say simply with a big S, exploitation, isn't it? And we are all capable of exploitation of others. And we can do this either on a gigantic social scale, such as in colonial structures, where we exploit an entire people, an entire nation, entire country, an entire race, and so forth. Or it can happen on a very individual level, where we exploit our partner, or exploit our children, or our children exploit their parents, etc., etc., etc. So we need to read this in a complex, expansive way. But the point of the verse is that rather than bemoaning the fact that we're experiencing hunger or thirst, we utilize it right there on the spot to create the causes to alleviate the hunger and thirst of others. So we do this by thinking that our hunger and thirst represents the suffering of all beings. And we now use that to take on the suffering of all others and to give them happiness. And it's this kind of direct dynamic that's being described so clearly in this verse that is so powerful in the Tonlen method, because it means it's not just an abstract meditation that floats out there in the ether, but it's something which we bring into play on top of the arising of suffering and afflictions in our own life. Having said this, you might think that you only practice Tonlen when you're having a bad time. The opposite is equally true in the thought transformation technique. If I'm suddenly feeling delight and happiness for whatever reason, rather than saying, mine, don't come near it, I'm having a really good time at the moment, just piss off, leave me alone, thank you very much. We say, may all the conditions, we flip it on its spot. We say, may all the sufferings and the factors that prevent others from experiencing happiness, temporal and ultimate, may that ripen on me right this instant, and may I give them all happiness and joy. And we do that on the basis of experiencing some joy in this moment. So you can see here that it doesn't actually matter whether we're experiencing joy or unhappiness when we're doing this technique, because the same technique works equally in either of those two situations, even for the situations in the middle. And those situations in the middle that are neither extremely happy nor extremely sad are actually crucial to consider, because one would suspect probably a vast amount of our lives are spent in those states. And they're basically not very energetic and not very incisive in the way that they inspire us to act. So what I mean by that is that when we have the category of stranger, for example, we don't feel anything particularly strongly against the stranger, and nor do we feel anything particularly attractive about the stranger. We know this when we watch the news on television. And that's the very criteria for holding that person as a stranger in our psychic sort of formation. It's because we haven't invested in them strongly, but nor have we disinvested in them strongly. And it's that very blandness of response that's enabling the category of stranger to get up and away, to exist, in other words. And so it's kind of a burial ground for productive transformation, this sort of inert stranger realm, this middle zone, because it's neither doing anything virtuous nor anything non-virtuous, and it's blocking out our awareness of others. So I just mentioned that because when we're watching television and we see the incredible suffering, it doesn't take very much, does it, to see. We have a station in Australia called SBS, which is a government, a federally run sort of multicultural television station, and has a lot of very, very poignant news services that aren't necessarily fashionable ones. It goes in for the deep analysis of different situations, and it's been showing some absolutely heart-rending images of mothers in Afghanistan. I'm sure you've seen the same, holding their starving babies and crying, saying, I can't feed it, I can't feed my baby, as the baby perishes in their arms. The unbelievable pain of that situation. So practice Tonlen. Don't just practice Tonlen. If you can do something dynamic to help, do it. Send some money or relief or whatever it is you're planning to do. But at least in that moment, you can actually do this meditation. And it creates the karmic causes for you to actually be able to do this in a future life. It's a commitment, a karmic commitment, and that's very profound. If you see a wounded animal that you rescue and you do the Tonlen practice as a promise to look after this being in all its future lifetimes, that karma will definitely ripen in that way. You'll be find yourself in a caring role, able to benefit that person in whatever life form they've taken in the future. So these are vast thoughts and very, very powerful. So Shantideva in chapter 3 of Guide to a Bodhisattva's Way of Life has some verses which resonate very strongly with this stanza. And he says, may a rain of food and drink descend to clear away the pain and thirst and hunger. And during the eon of famine, may I myself change into food and drink. This is extraordinary, isn't it? We're actually asking for a miraculous capacity to occur. So sometimes we see some benefactor, don't we, in the world, who with whatever means they have, is able to bring about a vast beneficial transformation, often using very, very slender provisions, just through the genius of their idea. And this is really because of a past promise to be able to do this along the lines that Shantideva was mentioning in this verse. Verse 10, may I become an inexhaustible treasure for those who are poor and destitute. May I turn into all things they could need, and may these be placed close beside them. So in this Tonlen practice, we can actually particularize the objects that we're giving. So if someone needs food, we give them food. If someone needs medicine, we give them medicine. If someone needs clothes, we give them clothes. It's up to our powerful creative empathy and imaginations to tailor the technique to be most powerful. And likewise, if someone's suffering illness, I've mentioned before, take that illness, not just illness in general, but take that very illness and then expand outwards. Verse 11, without any sense of loss, I shall give up my body and enjoyments, as well as all my virtues of the 3 times for the sake of benefiting all. So here, we're not just giving things out there, we're giving up our own body as service, and we're also giving all the accumulated merits that we've managed to somehow acquire. We're giving those away for others. And verse 12, by giving up all, sorrow is transcended, and my mind will realize the sorrowless state. It is best now that I give everything to all beings in the same way as I shall at death. So a little bit of a catch in the flick in the tail there, isn't it? Do it now. So you mightn't think that in your country, America, or our country here, Australia, that there's a great deal of suffering from hunger and thirst. And in this regard, we consider ourselves very fortunate. But when Geshe Doga was explaining this verse, he indicated that if this is our present situation, don't get blasé. It simply means that we haven't created the causes for hunger and thirst in this particular moment in time. But there could still be the causes for those things to occur, even, as we know, in this lifetime. So to be always vigilant and aware. But the real essence of this verse is to encourage us to be more honest and more generous. Taking what is not freely given and deceiving others in particular, such as luring other people with seductive scheming, in particular, can cause not just long-term, but intense, immediate suffering. So Nagarjuna wrote, "From generosity, we derive wealth. From morality, we derive higher status rebirth. In fact, we need both to carry out the bodhisattva's actions." And so wealth and having provisions like ample food and so forth in themselves aren't the problem. It's how we're responding to them and whether or not we're utilizing them in a powerful way. So I just thought we'd take a little sidestep here. It's quite relevant. There's, in relation to this idea of generosity, giving away everything, there are specific instructions to do with the practice of making offerings to the Triple Gem. And the advice is not to offer what we regard as useless, but what is most precious, what is of most value to us. So the good mentor Potawa, this Geshe Potawa is one of the Kadampa Geshis, warned about a situation in which, for example, we have 2 cakes of cheese. I'm talking about dried Tibetan cheese here. And we keep the fresh one for ourselves and we put the moldy one on our altar to offer it to the Buddhas, while saying, "I make this offering of rapturous food." That's a con. It's hypocritical. We shouldn't worry here that those to whom we're offering the Triple Gem are themselves needy. It's got more to do with our attitude of giving. So we give our best, no matter how poor we are. We should make offerings in a very, very deep and generous way, as a way of showing true honor and respect. And so the reverend revered Drupkung Gelek Gutso, this is one of the Gadampa stories, had only 1 teacup and he could not afford any offering bowls. Instead, he would clean his cup well, offer tea in it to the triumphant ones, to the holy refuge objects, and afterwards ask to borrow it back. Isn't that beautiful? In order that he could drink tea from it himself. And every day he went through that same ritual. I remember once when I was in India, the Venerable Sarah, some of us will know, I'm sure, said, told me a story about Lama Zopa Rinpoche wishing to make offerings of 1,000 salt offerings, which is a traditional offering, a very expansive offering, and he didn't have 1,000 offering bowls. And guess what he used instead? 1,000 pistachio shells, which was sufficient to put in a single grain of rice, which could then be visualized as all the most precious things in the universe to offer. So these practices are only limited by our imagination, our lack of imagination. So the final recognition in this verse, what thing to hit us should be that we recognize that hunger and thirst have matured through the kindness of our guru and the 3 jewels in order to further the purpose of our Dharma practice. This is often why when people go to Lama Zopa Rinpoche and say, "Lama, I've lost all my money and everything's gone," he says, how lucky you are. It's just sort of the exact opposite of what you'd expect to hear, isn't it? I've heard the same stories in relation to people going to Rinpoche and saying they've been diagnosed with terminal cancer. He says, now you practice. Very, very fortunate, very fortunate. So we'll move on to verse 13 now, and I'll get John to throw up the Joan translation. That's one with the coloured background. Yep, thank you. 13. Whenever we're powerlessly exploited and tormented by others, it is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for having hated those who are inferior and treated them as slaves. Now we should use our body and life in the service of others. So again, the verse is acting like a mirror, reflecting back the karmic causes that we've created ourselves. So you might think here that we're not actually guilty. We're not guilty of oppressing others. And again, as we saw with hunger and thirst, maybe in our particular country, in many, many ways, fortunate places, we don't see these as being widespread problems, although they are, of course, we just don't see them. But we do see many people who don't have freedom, in the sense that their lives are being controlled, often by an influential superior. Finding ourselves under control of such an oppressor, we have no time for rest, and we're forced to do things against our wishes, and there's always something more to do for them. Consequently, we can experience great suffering and continuous mental and physical torture. So we need to look for examples, in other words, of our own exploitative behaviour. This is pretty powerful stuff, isn't it? And it's useful here to think in terms of general or collective karma, as well as individual or personal karma. So profiting, for example, from slave labour in third world economies and unethical supply chains is a form of exploitation and domination of those who are weaker than ourselves. In Australia, we have a very real problem with boat people who are legitimate refugees who have arrived by boat, being put into detention centres, often with their children who are 1 or 2 years old, for 9 years without being effectively processed. So they're in a kind of legal limbo, stateless. They can't be returned to their country, and they're not being sent on. Some countries like New Zealand have very kindly offered to take our refugees from their detention because it's such an excruciating situation. They're embarrassed for us, I think, and our lack of compassion. So from a group karma point of view, we're all sharing in this karma if we enjoy the benefits of the economy, if you like, the social economy that thrives on this basis. And so some of us will have looked at supply chains in relation to clothing and fashion, which has been often our T-shirts and shirts are being produced by third world labour, often in concentration style situations. And the fact that we're delighted in our fashion garment and then throw it away when we're sick of it means that we're completely impervious to the background of this situation. Racism, Black Lives Matter. In Australia, we have ongoing issues about Aboriginal land rights. We keep mining sacred sites in the Northern Territory that are an essential part of the Aboriginal dreaming creation stories. And because the communities, Indigenous communities have been so fragmented by the force of Western occupation, are unable or effectively to mount an opposition to these incredibly powerful multinational mining juggernauts, which work hand in hand with both sides of government, unfortunately, to do their bidding. Not saying that all mining is evil or bad, but we've had some incredibly tragic stories in recent Australian history about this kind of exploitation occurring. I was thinking too, when preparing for this class, toxic masculinity and abuse in the family is another clear example. And it's interesting, isn't it, that spousal rape within marriage has only recently been recognized as a crime in many countries. And it was only made no longer not a crime in Singapore in 2020. Feminists at the moment are struggling in India to make it illegal to rape your wife. Up till now, it has not been a crime, no matter how violent that rape is. So these are all examples, aren't they, of domination and bullying that can have very, very pernicious effects. And so the antidote to this is to resolve, instead of exploiting this manner, to entrust our body and our life for the purpose of others. And again, Shantideva in verse 13 of chapter 3 says, having given up this body up for the pleasure of all living beings, by killing, abusing, and beating it, may they always do as they please. Although they may play with my body and make it a source of jest and blame, because I've given it to them, what is the use of holding it dear? Therefore, I shall let them do anything to it that does not cause them any harm. And when anyone encounters me, may it never be meaningless for them. So these are very, very provocative stanzas, aren't they? Because they violate our sense of personal integrity in a way that's very, very challenging and very radical. So we need to work on these things in a very gentle but insistent way to begin to make some resolve. And so again, the Tonlen meditation is very, very powerful, because it said we can practice giving our body away, transforming our body into perfect bodies for those who have got bodies that have fallen apart for whatever reason, without actually giving our body away at this moment, because we're not ready to. But when we become an Arya bodhisattva, someone who's realized emptiness directly, non-dualistically, we will be able to spontaneously perform any of these actions without any self-cherishing concern. So this is something to strive towards, but it's recognized to be an advanced spiritual practice to give away your body. But as we know, if we read the sutras, there are many, many examples of the Buddha in earlier lifetimes sacrificing his life. As we know in the Golden Light Sutra, the young prince offers his life to the hungry lioness in order to feed her cubs. So these are sort of exemplary examples of the generosity of giving. Verse 14, I might ask John to, same translation. Yeah. Oh. I'll read it out. I'm going to be, it's good to keep that there. 14, yeah. So I'll read it out. I'm going to read the Joan Nassel translation. Whenever unpleasant words arise to our ears, it is a sharp weapon of bad actions turning against us. For faults of speech, such as divisive talk and the like, now we should reproach our errors of speech. So examples of unpleasant words would be false accusations, senselessly reprimanding someone, spreading rumours or scurrilous insinuations, making disparaging verbal attacks. We all know that we're very capable of doing this if we're fueled by anger or one of the other delusions. Abusive, violent language or harangues, speaking nasty words about someone behind their back, pernicious gossip. So the strategy is, rather than bite back or attack, we think, look, I'm hearing unpleasant words myself as a result of my errors of speech in the past. of having used divisive speech on others, having caused them to disagree with one another, having spoken harsh words to them, having disparaged them, and so forth. From now on, through reproaching our errors of speech, we should no longer engage in them. So our speech, in other words, should become gentle, soft, and considerate. Gentle speech, I'm using gentle here in a very particular way, makes it possible for us to see clearly any differences and resolve or come to terms with these differences. We're talking about a conflict here. If we have gentle speech and we're handling or immersed in a conflict, we have the capacity to discern very, very clearly what's in play, because we're not superimposing over it in a very, very distorting manner. We can see both sides in the case of a conflict with a partner or a friend. And instead of using bad or hurtful words, we can bring about words that will somehow soothe, resolve, and bring some harmony to the situation. So speech is a very, very powerful gateway to God, particularly from a Buddhist perspective, because we often act precipitously, don't we, in speech, even before we've thought to ourselves, I didn't even know I was going to say that. I've had a situation where I've been very upset with someone, where I've flung out a verbal volley with such devastating precision that their face has crumpled and tears have begun to roll. And it's only then, I'm speaking here personally, did I realize the capacity that those words had to inflict a harm. So it's converse with gentle words. Even if we can't see the benefit of those words, they provide a safe haven, a safe environment for that person to be secure and to flourish. So not to underestimate the importance of that. And I just want to share a personal story. When I was going to I went to a Baptist boys' school. I went on a scholarship, and it was a very sport-orientated community, being a sort of a boys-only school. It really prided itself on its sporting prowess. And I had a friend who had been one of the children of thalidomide. Remember thalidomide? It was a drug given in the 50s. It was a soothing sedative given to pregnant women, often throughout the pregnancy. And it only was recognised as a problem retrospectively when many, many women gave birth to babies that were missing limbs or had limbs that hadn't formed properly. So my friend had a residual arm, you have to call it, a little arm, and he didn't have individual fingers, but he had two kind of fingers joined together in two sets that he could use very effectively. Other than that, perfectly intact in terms of a so-called normal body. But because of his hand, he couldn't row, but he couldn't hold the oar, but he could act as a coxswain for the other boy rowers on the Yarra River. So he relished that role. I went to school one day and he wasn't there. And I asked what had happened. And it turned out that this boy had committed suicide that night because his schoolmates had made fun of his arm while they were rowing. And because this boy was sort of emerging into young sort of adolescence, you can only imagine how much pain was associated with that attack. And he made that decision. So I can only think to myself what it must have been like for those boys who knew that what they had said in so-called jest had had such a devastating impact. So I just mentioned that story because it's, kind of resonates, doesn't it? So never underestimate the power of our speech. great damage can be done in a flash. So verse 15, thank you. We're rolling through them. You see, we've got many, many verses. So I'm quite conscious of not standing still. Verse 15. Whenever, well, I'll read this. I'll read my Joan version, but you can compare it to the version I've got on the screen here, which is the Berzin translation. That's all right, John, I can leave it there. Whenever we are born in any impure place whatsoever, it is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us. For having habituated ourselves with impure appearances, now we should habituate ourselves with pure appearances alone. So when our birthplace is, as it says in this translation, oppressive and full of wretched conditions, this is the wheel of sharp weapons returning from our own self-grasping and perverted views. So in this context, the conditions, considering our conditions of life as impure, has to be understood as impure in the sense that they are in the nature of suffering. And because of this, even a minor incident can harm our body and our mind. And we have to face receiving harm even from those very close to us. So what are, if we've got impure appearances here, how about having habituated ourselves with impure appearances, what might pure appearances be? From a tantric perspective, one of the pain, one of the causes of pain is that we view others and the world as impure or as ordinary, and we're not prepared to make any concessions. So in order to transform this, we need to generate visualizations of the place as pure. And we use our tantric visualization practices for this end. And the reason for this is that ordinary appearances are tyrannical. Because they're the product of delusion, they're constantly limiting our ability to see the nature of reality. And so we need to transplant that and push it aside through an alternative technique, which in a tantric terms is called visualizing places as pure. So based on the causal motivation of love, compassion, and the mind of enlightenment, we train our mind in accepting or seeing things that are arising to our senses as the sport of pure appearances, which are inseparable from bliss and emptiness. These are very pure, subtle states of mind. And also out of these state of bliss and emptiness, united, also arise the deities and the mandalas and so forth. So in the sacred words of Akshobhya, it says, at all times, one should train in the perception of all appearances as manifestations of pure visions, deriving from the illusion-like yoga, within which the wisdom cognizing emptiness arises as the body of the deity. Since the emptiness of mind that has the potential for perfect enlightenment is the naturally present Buddha nature, when all pollutants are cleansed, the emptiness of everything, the environment and the beings within it, will appear as deities. Although it is difficult to convey this idea in words alone, I have spoken about it here a little according to the instructions of my gurus. So Geshe Jumpa Gatso glosses this very, very condensed passage as follows. Having meditated upon emptiness and arisen in the body of a deity from emptiness, one should train on all occasions in seeing everything as pure, that is, as the body of the deity, the mandala of the deity, and so forth. In short, whatever one sees is the body of the deity, whatever one hears is the sound of the mantra, and whatever one thinks is the mind of the deity. One should thus train in pure appearance. When the adventitious stains are removed, the emptiness of the environment and the inhabitants appear as the sport of the deity. In other words, when the adventitious stains are removed, the adventitious stains are the blockages that our delusions have imposed upon our mind so that we can't operate outside that sphere. When they're removed, whatever appears is the environment of the deity, the body of the deity, and so forth. So throughout the entire sadhana rite, it is vital that one proceeds, and this is instructions to us who are those of us who are practicing some tantric sadhana on a daily basis. We proceed through the various visualization techniques while remaining undistracted from the awareness of emptiness. In this way, everything will then appear as the mere constructs of thought. In contrast to perceiving the deity appearance as illusion-like and empty of substantial existence, your visualization of the deity takes place while the glue of grasping at the substantiality still remains evident. Your meditations cannot be of any help, cutting off the root of an enlightened experience or existence. On the other hand, if your visualization is enforced by the view of emptiness, meditation on the visualization sequences can become powerful in destroying the root of cyclic existence. Therefore, in order to cut off the root of unenlightenment, it is essential to have the wisdom that is the direct opposite to grasping at substantial reality of things and events. So this is obviously a very, very profound instruction, but it's very important to know it's there, and we can participate in these practices given seeking out the right circumstances. So Kabje Lama Zopa Rinpoche says that the meaning of practicing pure appearance is, quote, that the essence of everything is transcendental wisdom of non-dual bliss and emptiness, since everything is the manifestation of the deity's mind, holy mind, the Dharmakaya, that is pure. But he also adds, the practice of guru devotion according to Sutric Mahayana does not give instruction to stop ordinary appearance of the guru, and there is no mention of visualizing the guru of a deity. This is something mentioned in only guru yoga practice of Tantra. So this is worth knowing as well. So often when we hear teachings from our teachers, they'll talk about seeing the guru as indistinguishable from the Buddha and so forth. These are practices that are occurring within this tantric framework. So Buddhayana Shri, in his Sadhana of Samantabhadra, says, quote, apart from the mind of ordinary conceptions, there are no sufferings of existence and becoming. To that which is the embodiment of the profound and the vast, no conceptions of ordinariness arise. So what I want us to take from this is the very assumption of ordinariness is itself a mental obscuration, because it's blocking us from seeing and exploring the bottomless potential of our own mind, which is naturally free of the adventitious defilements. If the mind wasn't naturally free of the adventitious defilements, we wouldn't have a Buddha nature that could transform into the enlightened body and mind of a Buddha, the two kayas or three kayas, or however we break it up. But even from a non-tantric perspective, it's vital that from beginning to end, we don't separate from a state of awareness that things are empty from where they appear to really be. And these points, which are to do with seeing the various manifestations of things as the sport of emptiness, are directly addressed in later stanzas of our root text. I'm just going to quote two of those stanzas to inspire us of what's ahead. Verse 105 of Wheel of Sharp Weapons says, "O mind, understand that the topics discussed here are interdependent phenomena all. For things must rely on dependent arising. To have an existence, they cannot stand alone. The process of change is alluring like magic. The physical form is but mental appearance, as a torch whirling round seems like a circle of flame." Verse 106, "There is nothing substantial to anyone's life force. It crumbles apart like a water-soaked log. And there is nothing substantial to one's lifespan. It bursts in an instant like bubbles of foam. All the things of this world are but fog-like appearance. When closely examined, they fade out of sight. Like mirages, these things at a distance seem lovely, but when we come closer, they are not to be found." So these are extraordinarily profound verses, and they're dealing with the section of our text which is dealing with the cultivation of ultimate bodhicitta. At the moment, we're dealing with the cultivation of conventional bodhicitta, but it's really showing, or I'm indicating how these ideas are already seeded, if you like, or embedded in some of the earlier verses. And I'll just remind us that verse 107 from Lama Chopa says, "We seek your blessings to perfect samadhi on illusion by realizing how all phenomena lack true existence, yet still appear like a mirage, a dream, or the image of a moon in a still lake." So as Arya Deva says in his 400 stanzas, even to suspect, even to have a doubt, a trembling doubt, moment of doubt that things don't inherently exist as they appear to do, shakes the very foundations of samsara. So if we're going to cultivate a genuine compassion, we have to tackle these topics, because it's necessary to uproot the self-grasping attitude in order to stop the cycle of suffering existence, and so must other beings who are suffering. So we therefore make the aspiration to become fully enlightened in order to benefit them, and part of that is a commitment to realizing the actual nature of reality so that we might begin to make real progress on the path. So Geshe Doga describes this as the necessity of streaming our attitude. I kind of like that phrase, streaming our attitude. Even if we can't practice the high view of seeing all things as a play of deep wisdom, the union of bliss and emptiness, nonetheless, we can still create a peaceful and safe living environment by creating the causes within ourselves. We can stream our attitude and our actions into a more positive path and cause an immediate change to our living conditions. So in other words, if we begin to transform our minds, our sense of the ordinary, the hard, concrete fixedness of the ordinary, which is acting to tyrannize our ability to grow and transform, will begin to transform from within spontaneously. The very fact that we're having a cognitive change will mean that things will appear to us differently. I'm sure we've all had examples of this where our attitude towards someone has changed and suddenly we see them as an adorable, lovely person. They didn't appear that way yesterday. Suddenly they are. What's happened there? One would have to say that the person hasn't changed. We've changed. And now they're appearing endearing, and delightful. And so there's no limit to this potential if we begin to work on our mind. Verse 16. Whenever we're separated from helpful and loving friends, it is the sharp wheel of bad actions turning against us for having enticed others' servants away from them. Now we should no longer part others from their servants. So we might sort of protest here and say, I haven't got servants. And we probably might not have servants because we're not perhaps living in a feudal class system. But again, we have to think of possible past lifetimes where these conditions might have been intact. And in terms of this life, we do have to think very carefully how we might have interfered with and even have jeopardized the support structures that people have set in place for their own security. And that we've interfered, we've enticed them away or dragged them away from these support structures due to entirely selfish motives. I just know, looking around me in the world, ordinary world of Melbourne, how many relationship breakups occur on these sorts of bases. I've got one friend whose husband left her for a younger woman. This is almost a litany, isn't it? And it was a very painful breakup to many, ricocheted all over the place, the damage of this breakup. And he was with the new woman, the young woman, for a year, and then she was swapped for yet another one. So there's a trail here of disarray, really, because each of these relationships had other children connected to them. So all these kids were being profoundly impacted, let alone my friend who had been separated from as well. So these are very tangible examples of being separated from helpful and loving friends, aren't they? And so if we find ourselves in that situation, then we need to read this in terms of a karmic cause. Instead of feeling sad and depressed, in other words, we should focus our mind on benefiting others. And Geshe-do gave a very tantalizing suggestion at this point of his commentary on this verse. He said that attempting to convert others away from their religion is an example of the wheel of the karma being discussed in this particular verse. That's interesting, isn't it? When I was a schoolboy, and I was sort of at that arrogant phase of knowing, I think I knew everything, at least for 1 or 2 years there. And one of my friend's father was a Christian minister. And it took me a year of rigorous plying of my verbal skills to get him to give up his Christian faith because it was silly. And then the school year came to an end. This was sort of our final year of secondary school, and we all went our separate ways. 2 years later, another mutual friend told me that that particular person, that young man, had sunk into a profound depression in the following years. And I, in all honesty, can't say that I wasn't responsible, or at least majorly responsible for that, because I did absolutely everything within my ingenious perversity to talk him out of his religious faith. So these are really, really extraordinarily powerful and meaningful verses, aren't they? Verse 17. Whenever all the holy ones are unhappy with us, it is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for having rejected the holy and relied upon bad friends Now we should reject bad friends. And so the karmic consequence here is having rejected the holy, repudiating those who are wishing to incline us towards virtue, but also relying on friends who also support us inclining towards non-virtue in whatever way. So in the past lives, we have never met or have never followed the holy gurus. We have ignored them and cultivated instead evil friends. Now these contaminated actions ripen upon ourselves. Even today, we do not follow the Dharma, but are inclined to follow misleading friends. Hence, resolve not to follow those who turn you away from the right path, though of course, do not exclude them from your compassion, for to do so would break the bodhisattva vow. So these words spoken by Geshe Nawandagi. And in that last part, he's saying that if you abandon someone who you might regard as a bad friend, you're actually breaking the vow of love. And we have to make a distinction here. We can care for the bad friend, we can look after the bad friend, but not follow the bad friend's badness, if you like. We need to be incredibly strong, incredibly discriminating and careful in the way that we respond, but never in our heart do we abandon them as a precious being who has full potential to become enlightened and so forth. So we'll go now to verse 18. I'm going to read the Venerable Jones translation. Whenever negativities and so forth, due to others' exaggeration and deprecation occur, verse 18 there. Yeah, it is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for having disparaged holy beings. Now we should abandon disparaging others with exaggeration and deprecation. I'll only touch upon the meaning of this verse because it's really an extension of the previous verse, and the instruction is the same. And again, we can use it for Tonglen meditation. But it's particularly referring to situations where we're wrongly or falsely accused of having done something we haven't done. Moreover, this accusation involves either exaggerating, dressing up the claim to make it appear more convincing, more compelling, or via deprecation, which you see here in the second line of the verse. The accuser uses whatever means available to bring us undone. It involves lying and character assassination, in other words. So I think, again, we need to look at our own behaviour here and also our cultural behaviours. And I feel that the prevalence of trolling, for example, is a very clear example of creating this karma, isn't it? And we have many health professionals in Australia who are being trolled at the moment with life threats. I know the same thing's happening in America over the management of COVID. These are highly contentious issues. But to troll someone with a death threat is clearly not only a deprecation, but an exaggeration of gargantuan proportions. And it's designed to bring that person completely undone and to demolish them, not just in themselves, but in the public standing. So these are very powerful karmas, and they have extensive results. And I feel that, as have many who have commented on the role of virtual social media, it's almost as though the separation of the person from their victim, because of the intermediary of the technology itself, emboldens the troll to be even troller, to be more powerfully vindictive, more powerfully destructive, to broadcast more and more lies and damages, and then hit and run. And before there's any chance to assess the situation, another barrage of trolling occurs. And so I know that a lot of young school age girls and women have this same experience of trolling in relation to their bodies, people making fun of their bodies, and it's often girlfriends doing it. And it can create incredible depression and suffering in that person. So what appears to be kids' fun or gang activity can have very, very corrosive and dangerous outcomes. So the conclusion here should be that we control our own mind, not seek to control the mind of others. We do not need to control other people, but we need to control ourselves. So we'll jump on to verse 19. Whenever our necessary articles go to waste, it is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for having disregarded others' needs. Now we should accomplish the needs of others. So in the commentaries, a number of the Geshes and Lamas make the very, very crucial point here that wishing for qualities for ourselves alone constitutes already constitutes disregarding others' needs and prevents us from accomplishing the needs of others. And so the real core topic of this 19th verse is self-cherishing. It's because of self-cherishing turning against us that we now find that our provisions and articles go to waste. So this is referring to things like our house falling down, our car breaking, our plumbing bursting, all the things that we take for granted that are going to hold together, one after the other, seem to collapse or deteriorate. There's a karmic reason behind this, and it's connected to having disregarded the needs of others and also having disregarded their provisions as well, of course. So this requires a deep extended contemplation. We have wished that we alone should be free of suffering rather than wishing that all others may be free of suffering. So we need to address or redress the reason why, as a karmic result, we experience our own necessary articles going to waste. So we'll jump to verse 20 on to show us the Burzen translation here, which is the, thank you, verse 20. Whenever we have a joyless mind and an unclear heart, I'm reading the Venerable Jones first. It is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for having accumulated negativities in other rebirths. Now we should eliminate the conditions for others' negativities. But the Burzen translation, I think, is more evocative. It says, when our minds are unclear and our hearts are unhappy, we are bored doing virtue, but excited by vice. This is the wheel of sharp weapons returning full circle upon us from wrongs we have done. Till now, we have led others to acts of non-virtue. Hereafter, let's never provide the conditions that rouse them to follow their negative trays. In the commentaries, the Lamas refer to this idea of our minds being unclear and our hearts being unhappy as appearing particularly when we're attempting to practice virtue. And so they're referring to those situations where we might be really wanting to practice Dharma very purely and very energetically, such as maybe we're decided to do a retreat. And instead of becoming radiant and happy, we find our minds becoming heavy, groggy, clouded, and our hearts despondent and heavy. So it's a very personal question. Have you experienced this happening? It's the same thing as when we're attempting to read a Dharma text or a Dharma commentary, and 2 sentences on, we're beginning to be bored. We're yawning. We're bored by doing virtue, and we turn to a distraction. We check our phone, our Facebook page, and so forth. So we're excited by vice, but not excited by virtue. So there's a karmic reason for this. It's the wheel of sharp weapons returning. But I thought just to mention here that we need to be careful understanding the meaning of this confusion as merely a karmic result, which it is, if it leads us not to redressing or dealing with the problem in a very practical way. So I thought to just mention a few words about depression. If people are dealing with depression in a significant way, it may, deep down, it's beneficial to be practicing Dharma, but on a sort of existential level, to do with our daily reality, it might be very helpful to seek some form of professional advice and input. And I think some of us here might have read Andrew Solomon's very important book on depression called The Noonday Demon. Has anyone read that book? It's his own personal account of dealing with depression. And he says, when we're depressed, the past and the future are absorbed entirely in the present moment, as in the world of a 3-year-old. You cannot remember time when you felt better, at least not clearly, and you cannot imagine a future time where you'll feel better. Being upset, even profoundly upset, is a temporal experience, while depression is atemporal. Breakdowns leave you with no point of view, quote. So then he talks about mild depressions and very heavy depressions. But he says that, real depression takes up bodily occupation. Our eyelids become heavy, our muscles we can't even hold our spines erect. So like physical pain, it becomes chronic, and it seems as though there was no alleviation. Of course, the fact of the depression itself appears to be our primary knowledge of the world. So this kind of depression needs very sophisticated approaches to work with. So I'm just mentioning that because, again, as I mentioned a few classes ago, there'll be some very pure Buddhists, or I call them puritanical Buddhists, actually. He'll say all you need is Dharma, practice Dharma, do purification, do 500,000 prostrations to the Buddha and purify, and you won't be depressed anymore. But if someone is really, really depressed, those sorts of solutions aren't available. And so we need to care for that person in many other ways. And Andrew Solomon, in his very moving book, says the most remarkable person, there are a number of remarkable people in his life, but probably his father was the most remarkable, because even when Andrew Solomon was unable to lift his head from the pillow to eat a mouthful of food, such was his depression, that his father would be there every day with a spoon, offering him food. He never gave up. He never abandoned his son. So I think that's a remarkable testament to the power of love, isn't it? So I just mentioned that as a very, that depression is a delicate matter. So verse 21, whenever unsuccessful in our activities, our mind is agitated. It is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for having obstructed the actions of the holy ones. Now we should abandon all such interferences. So lack of success here, unsuccessful in our activities, can refer to a lack of success in our Dharma studies and practices. And it can also refer to worldly activities such as one's career, one's relationships, and so forth. And so, again, there's a karmic reason for this experience, and we need to purify that by practicing in an alternative way. So, not obstructing the actions of the holy ones, not obstructing virtue, not interfering in the well-being of others through the force of self-cherishing. And this work of negative karma, of hindering the work of holy beings in the past, is now ripening upon me, and I'm experiencing its effects. Since I'm experiencing it now, we think to ourselves, I will not have to experience it in the future. Therefore, this karma is purified. So from this perspective, in these verses, the very fact that we're undergoing a hardship of whatever kind is itself a positive thing, because it's the manifestation of the ripening karma, which because of that ripening will be exhausted and not have to be experienced again. And so it's even said that in the case of people having maybe committed very severe non-virtue, perhaps they're a mass murderer, for example, in a past lifetime, that if they're practicing very sincerely virtue and taking refuge in caring for others and so forth, that incredibly powerful karma can ripen in a lesser form, a lesser suffering. So that's also something to bear in mind. But the main thing in this verse is that when we're unsuccessful in our activities, we shouldn't blame others. So here, when things don't work out the way we had planned, we tend to blame our parents, we blame our children, we blame our teachers, we blame our employees, we become bitter, we become twisted, we can become alcoholic, and so forth. There are all sorts of destructive ways in which we blame the world around us for what's not working for us. And so it's the self-cherishing that's producing this vast scenario that we're battling. So we're grappled, if you like, with our own monstrous self-cherishing, mistaking that to be the world. So we need to break that nexus. So I'll jump to 22. Whenever our Lama is not pleased, no matter what we do, it is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for having acted hypocritically towards the holy Dharma. Now we should work to reduce our hypocrisy regarding the Dharma. So I'm just going to tell a rather delightful story here. Some of us will know the story. It's the story of Geshe Ben. In the past, there was a Geshe named Bengongal. While he was meditating one day, he received a message saying that his sponsor would visit the following day. So he cleaned up his house and set out the offerings, water bowls, incense, etc. He put them all on his altar and arranged them very nicely. Then he took himself a seat and started meditating. While meditating, he reflected upon himself and started questioning, why did I so neatly prepare the altar today, unlike my regular method of making offerings and keeping the place clean and so on? He further reasoned, if setting the altar nicely and so forth is out of respect for the three jewels, then I should be doing it regularly, which I have not been doing. Nor did I do this for the purpose of my mind training. I did it only to display to my sponsor and to garner honor and respect from him. So I did this simply because of the 8 worldly concerns. Thinking this, he grabbed a handful of dust and threw it upon the altar while saying, I throw this dust into the mouth of the 8 worldly concerns. Then he seated himself in his meditation cell rather haphazardly, sort of loosely, if you like, not in a very formal meditation posture, When his sponsor came, to his surprise, he saw the altar scattered with dust, and he asked the Geshe, "Geshe-la, how come the altar is like this?" To which the Geshe responded, "This is normally how I have it." However, the sponsor, being a great devotee of the Geshe, took it as if the Geshe must have done this for some specific reason. So without entertaining any misunderstanding, he offered his services and then left. Meanwhile, Galwa Dron Tompa, who we know as Atisha's chief Tibetan disciple and lineage holder, knew about this incident through his clairvoyant powers and praised Geshe Ben by saying, quote, "There is no one other than this Geshe Ben who is able to spew dust into the mouth of the 8 worldly concerns." So again, right on the spot of our worldly concerns, we apply the antidotes. So I just quote here Kabje Zopa Rinpoche. "Freedom from the 8 worldly concerns creates real peace. Therefore, we have to renounce them. Renunciation is the mental action arising from a decision. It is difficult. It is harder to change mental actions than physical ones. To do so requires a positive mind of not allowing it to happen. To do so requires a positive mind, and not allowing it to happen comes from the negative mind. Our problems are not the objects we encounter or the pleasures we experience, but the desires themselves. The mind. Suffering is created by my mind. We must know how this works beyond just an intellectual understanding of it." So this verse in Wheel of Sharp Weapons is asking us to bravely examine our states of mind and to work directly on what our focus has revealed. In other words, we must be aware of whether or not our external and internal actions are consistent with one another. In other words, we should not externally appear to be doing the right thing while internally doing the opposite. This is what the text means when it refers to feigning pious manners in the Berzin translation. Another word for feign is to fake it. The dictionary says pretend to be affected by feeling a state or an injury. So I'll just tell you an amusing story here. On one study night at Tara Institute, the students were sitting there in deep meditation, and not a movement to be seen. And Geshe Doga launched into a kind of harangue, you'd have to say, an enlightened harangue. He accused us all of being fraudulent because we were pretending to deeply meditate. And we've seen this in our meditation classes in our Buddhist centers sometimes. So someone's doing virtue and they open their eyes during the meditation and peep around to see whether anyone else is meditating as well as they are, or whatever. You know, there's kind of almost spiritual competitiveness going on. We try to orientate our practice according to the perceived flaws in others' practices and so forth. There's a kind of brinkmanship and upmanship going on. So all of these are forms of hypocrisy if we haven't actually earned the right to claim to have these benefits. So Geshe Doga added to that harangue by saying that the evidence that we were pretending was that only a Buddha is capable of sitting in meditative equipoise and to realize what's going on around him at the same time, i.e. they can have a direct realization of emptiness and realize appearances that are empty simultaneously. This is something that only occurs when we've removed the obscurations to omniscience completely. So we're acting as though we've already removed them. So we must first recognize our mistakes. So there's an analogy of a fruit given by, I'm conscious of the time, given by Nagarjuna in Letter to a Friend. He says, view people like mango fruit, unripe, which appear ripe, ripe, which appear unripe, unripe, which appears unripe, and ripe, which appears ripe. Don't rush to judge others. So don't judge a book by its cover. So we might end there. I was going to finish with verse 23, but we'll deal with that next week. I'm conscious of the pace. I hope that I'm managing to expand the topic sufficiently with each verse. What's your feeling about pushing through the verses quickly? And would you prefer to spend more time with fewer verses and maybe not complete the text? This is something that I've been sort of working with myself. Stephen.
Hello, Ross. First of all, thank you for opening up the class for input from the students. It's sometimes been my experience where the second alternative happens, where the instructor with the best of intentions will go through and then spend a lot of time on the first few verses and then, and then race through them. I would hope for like a more measured pace for all of the verses, but that's just my opinion. And I'd like to hear from anyone else. Just, raise your hand or whatever you want, or just jump in and, express your opinion, please.
Yeah. Doris, hi.
Thank you very much, Ross. My thought is that there's not always, but it might be considered to add in more classes at the end as we get closer. I don't know if, that's what we've been doing in other courses.
Yeah. From my side, I'd be very, very happy to do that. Is there an opportunity there? It changes, the feeling of some pressure there, because there's something auspicious in completing a text, by the way. So it's good. We often leave the last verse or the last line unexplained to create the causes of having that teaching again in the future. But apart from that, it's very good to complete what we set out to do. So I'd be more than happy to add some extra classes.
Maybe you can use that with Venerable Dondra, like ahead of time, and relax your pace as you feel more comfortable.
Yeah. Do others feel comfortable with that?
I think somebody might have, Stephen, or maybe you would have to talk with Venerable Dondra.
Yes, we'll have to get an approval of that, of course.
Yeah, because he's got a whole, year ahead or something.
Yes,
but
I
personally, I enjoy your commentaries and your stories to bring it to, this life and what we're doing today. So I like going through it and having a little bit more explanation. So I appreciate all that you're doing in that regard.
Lewis.
I was going to say, I've been to this is my third basic program course at the center, and the other two were always extended as was needed. And it just seems the rule, if you want to do a good job, you need more courses, you need more evenings and stuff.
Well, I'll write to the Venerable and propose that possibility, and it'll be up to him to decide. But I think under those circumstances, though, we can't make it compulsory to attend an extended program, can we, Stephen? If people are doing the BP program, if we do extend it, because people have come in on a basis that would then
Yeah, that's a very good point, Ross. What we have, and if people aren't aware, I'll mention it, is we also have kind of a pickup class on Friday mornings, where Venerable Dondrup will actually show Ross's video and then provide facilitation and answer questions and, you know, additional explanations and so on. So that's one way of mitigating, you know, extending the class. You know, I don't know. I would take it by like a case-by-case basis, Ross, and just assess, you know, the students', you know, attendance and desire, and, you know, they might have extenuating circumstances, and just all, you know, just look at it with regard to each student. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I'll leave it. I'll invite or request that students communicate with Stephen very directly, so that he's then in a position to let me know what the flavour of it, the situation is, if you like, and I'll adapt, because I wanted to make it as enjoyable and as meaningful as possible. And on that basis, I've sort of tackled it the way I have today, but I'm conscious we're moving through the verses much more quickly. But in another sense, there's a similar pattern that's been set up by the verses, structure of the verses at the moment, at least in the text, which makes it easier to move more quickly, because they're really incidents of the ripening of particular acts of self-cherishing in particular forms, one after the other. So they're diagnostic tools, really, to begin to read the world differently, according to our thought transformation practice. And so I think that legitimizes moving more quickly. But when we get to some of the more complex, these are complex enough, but when we get to some of the very complex verses later on, particularly those dealing with the nature of reality, we're going to be brought to a much slower pace. So I'd like to be able to spend some good time at that point and not rush those verses. So that's a concern to me, yeah. All right, well, thank you very much for attending again today. And as I said, the takeout for this subject is to do the Tonlen meditation in your daily practice. And this is giving you 1,001 ways of doing so. So thank you very much. And I'll hand you over now to the discussion that Stephen will lead. And thank you.